Detective John Carter thought it was just another night on patrol until he saw a lone German shepherd sitting in the rain, eyes fixed on an abandoned house. That dog, later named Max, refused to move for days, staring at the same door as if guarding a secret. What Carter found inside, with Max leading the way, would shock the entire town. 23 missing children, hidden beneath the floorboards. Stay with us because you won't believe what happened next. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories of real-life heroes. The afternoon slid into evening with the kind of quiet that makes a town feel older than it is. John Carter eased his sedan off the two-lane and let it idle at the edge of the old rail spur where a line of rusted boxcars slept under cottonwood trees. The western sky wore a thin orange ribbon that would be gone in minutes. He could smell creosote damp leaves, and under that, the faint mineral tang of iron and standing water. It had been 30 years since he wore a uniform that wasn't a badge, but some sounds still put him back on a different continent. Wind moving through aluminum siding, gravel shifting under steady feet. The smallest noises can wake old training. He scratched the side of his jaw and glanced at the dog in the back seat. Max watched him without blinking amber eyes, alert ears forward, that focused stillness John had learned to read like a sentence. "You're seeing something." "I'm not," John said. His voice stayed low, a habit from stakeouts and long nights that taught him not to waste words. Max's gaze cut past John, past the line of boxcars, to a maintenance shed tucked against the berm, one of those cinder block cubes the railroad had stopped using when the freight died. Someone had boarded its window with mismatched planks. The door wore a hardware store padlock and a recent coat of gray paint that didn't quite match the walls. Paint always tells on a place. New where everything else is old tends to have a reason. John sipped from a lukewarm coffee he didn't really want, and told himself this was nothing. They were supposed to be watching the river path for a repeat copper thief not wandering a dead yard at dusk, because his dog stared at a shed like it owed him money. Still, the hair rose a little at the base of his neck. He told himself it was the wind. He told himself a lot of things these days. He opened the door and stepped out, gravel crunching under his boots. Max waited for the command, every muscle quiet, and charged. "Out," John said. The shepherd jumped down lightly, nose-high, drawing scent in careful drafts as if he were tasting the air. John had seen him do this for narcotics, for a missing wallet, for a lost child at the county fair, whose mother could not remember if she'd last seen him by the kettle corn or the face painter. In each of those, Max had kept his tail at half-mast and his body loose, working a search pattern with confident patience. Now he was different. The tail hung still, not tucked, just steady. His walk was a measured line straight toward the shed. No spirals, no grid. He sat down exactly 6 feet from the door, aligned with the padlock, and stared the kind of staring that isn't curiosity, but resolve. A freight horn moaned somewhere miles away, and a flock of starlings folded themselves across the sky like a shifting net. John hooked his thumbs in his jacket pockets and let the seconds count. "You want me to make the first move?" he said, almost smiling. "That's your trick." Max neither blinked nor looked back. He did not yield the door a single inch of his attention. The orange at the horizon thinned toward ash. On paper, John had no cause to tug a padlock off a private structure just because his dog found theology in a painted door. He walked a slow arc around the shed instead, noting the patchwork gravel river stone here, darker ballast there like someone had filled trenches out of different piles. On the north side, a plastic vent as round as a dinner plate broke the otherwise blank wall. Its slats wore a throat of dust. He put his fingers near it. The air wasn't warm, but it moved. A thread of stale damp kissed his knuckles, a smell like old cardboard and wet rope. He told himself it could have been raccoons or a leak or some kid's hideout that wasn't more than beer cans and a flashlight. He crouched, listening. Through the low hum of evening, he thought just once he heard a sound from inside that wasn't the settling of block or wind. Not a voice. Something small shifting. His mind, as it sometimes did, named the sound before he allowed it shuffling. Then it was gone, replaced by the silence that can feel like it's studying you. He stood and looked at Max. The dog didn't whine. He didn't paw or bark. He simply held his vigil. The memory of a different room slid under John's ribs, a concrete schoolhouse in a hot province where he had once learned that doors could mean more than one thing, and time moved like an animal's shadow, quick and slow at once. He shook it off and did the practical work text to dispatch logging his location, a note to Sergeant Bill Hunter that he would run a quick check on an old structure at the yard, a mental estimate of how many minutes of light remained before his flashlight became the only line he could draw. Bill would tease him about seeing ghosts. Tom Reed would offer to swing by with a second set of eyes and a fresh thermos. The notion warmed something in him. He thumbed in the car's trunk release and fetched the crowbar, not to pry so much as to feel the weight of it in his hand. Then he set it down again. Procedure mattered. Even in small towns where people knew your doctor and the pharmacist wrote you a note in Sharpie to remind you of the card you left on the counter, the line between instinct and trespass had to stay bright. Not today, he told the shed. We'll do this with a key. Max's ear twitched at his voice, but the dog refused the invitation to be done. He sat straighter, chest lifting, eyes never leaving the padlock. If loyalty has a shape, it looks like a dog refusing to look away from the thing he believes the rest of the world needs to see. All right, John said, and he heard the softness in his own voice. We saw it. We're going. He guided Max back to the car. The shepherd obeyed with a reluctance that was dignified, like a veteran saluting a flag he did not want lowered yet. They drove the long way around toward the river path, and John let the radio murmur about a fender bender out near the feed store, a domestic call resolved without anyone spending the night in county, a weather advisory about fog rolling up from the water after midnight. He answered 2 check-ins from Tom, then let the night swallow the yard in his mirror. By the time he clocked out, the town had settled into its winter hush. He took Max home to the small house on Cedar, where the porch light burned low and steady, and the steps knew his weight. He hung the jacket and holster on their pegs and filled Max's bowl. The dog ate without hurry, and then lay on the kitchen rug, chin on paws, watching John wash the day's coffee out of the pot. The television glowed in the next room with the volume low news anchors saying the world was doing the things the world always did. He turned it off and let the house remind him, a quiet could be honest, not empty. He was halfway to sleep when he heard the scratch. At first, it did not register as urgent, just a sound the night makes when the furnace kicks or a branch tickles a downspout. Then it came again, steady, rhythmic at the front door. Max was already on his feet. The shepherd stood in the dark hallway, not barking, not vocal at all, only looking at John with a brightness that refused to dim. Someone at the door, John whispered, and felt silly as soon as he said it, the way people talk to dogs when they need to talk themselves into motion. He flicked on the porch light. The rectangle of frosted glass gave him shapes a shadow, low and broad. When he opened the door, the winter air stepped in like a firm handshake. Max had brought the leash in his mouth. The loop hung from his jaws the way a messenger carries a letter. He set it gently at John's feet, then sat and lifted one paw, a precise, patient gesture that said more than any sound could. Dirt dusted his fur along the belly and legs. The smell of creosote and riverstone clung to him. John touched the pad of the raised paw and found it cool, not cold enough to worry him, but not the temperature it would have been if the dog had been on the kitchen rug since the evening. You jumped the fence, John said, but there was no anger in it, only the amazement of a man who has been given a second chance to believe his suspicions matter. He pictured the backyard gate latched the way he always latched it, and the gap under the far corner he had meant to fix in August when the dry ground pulled away from the post. If a determined shepherd wanted to be out, the world was short on ways to stop it. John crouched and met Max's eyes, nose to nose. The dog's breath warmed his cheek. He stroked between the ears and felt the tension there, not fear but insistence. The leash lay in a neat circle on the mat, a private geometry of urgency. "You went back," John said. Saying the words put the shape of the night in order, the shed, the vent, the smell of wet rope, and now his dog bringing him the tools for going out again. The suggestion was not open to debate. Max stood when John reached for the coat. He paced once in a tight semicircle and then stilled, waiting the way soldiers used to wait for a green light at a door. John checked his watch. The numbers said the hour when the town forgets itself and becomes only houses holding their separate breaths. He texted Bill again because good habits save lives, and told himself that if this turned out to be a raccoon, he would endure all the jokes Tom could throw at him for a month. He wrote heading back to rail yard to check a maintenance shed. "We'll keep you posted," he added, bringing Max. The fingers that typed that name felt steadier than they had 10 minutes ago. He clipped the leash to the collar and felt the solid click that always reminded him of right decisions. Outside, the night made its music a faraway semi groaning through gears on the state road, the soft patter of last leaves letting go. Somewhere a dog 2 streets over making one brief sleepy huff to announce a dream. Frost had ghosted the lawn. He followed Max down the walk, gravel soft underfoot, the porch light guttering behind them like a candle in a draft. The town at that hour belongs to those who keep promises. John and Max walked the block to the car, and he did not rush because hurrying and hasty are not the same thing, because there is a dignity in measured motion that keeps fear from borrowing trouble. In the driver's seat, he let the heater clear the glass while Max sat without fidgeting, head-up eyes on the road. The dog did not whine. He did not paw the door. He simply waited with the composure of a creature who has done the math and come to a conclusion he trusts his partner to honor. They slid through empty streets. Holiday lights twined around lampposts gave off a tired cheer. At the light by the feed store, the signal cycled for nobody. When they turned onto the gravel lane that edged the rail yard, Max leaned forward just enough to show recognition. John cut the engine and listened. Wind moved the cottonwoods. Somewhere water tapped a patient beat into a metal gutter. He could feel his pulse in his fingers, not fast, not slow, just present. He opened the door. Cold bit his face clean. Max waited for the word and got it out. The dog hit the ground and drew in 3 deep breaths. His body organized itself into a line, and he went. Not a pull, not a lunge and arrow. He led John down the margin of the berm to the cinder block shed. The padlock caught the moonlight. The gray paint on the door looked grayer. The vent's throat exhaled the same stale draft, but stronger now that the temperature had dropped and the pressure inside wanted to equalize. Max sat in the exact same place he had sat before, at the exact same distance, in the exact same posture, like a man who has returned to a church pew because he is not finished with what he came to say. John felt the decision draw itself inside him like a slow, certain breath. There are moments when a life sends up a flare. You can drive past it and hope someone else saw, or you can stop and mark the coordinates. He laid his palm against the door. The cold reached through the wood. He didn't hear a voice. He didn't need to. The dog's stillness did the talking. "All right," John said, and it was not a surrender so much as an agreement between partners who had long since learned each other's language. "We'll do this right. We'll get the key." He raised the phone thumb hovering over Bill's name, then pressed the call and watched his breath rise in white threads, while the ring worked its way toward another man's nightstand. He kept his other hand on the door as if the contact were a promise. Max leaned into his leg, warm and solid, a living anchor at the hinge between the known and the not yet known. In that thin hour under the cottonwoods and the quiet rail, the signal had been sent and received. Whatever waited on the far side of that gray paint would meet them in the morning with proper eyes and proper light. For now, it was enough to stand and listen to a place that did not want to be listened to, and decide together not to look away. The following morning carried the sharpness of early frost, each blade of grass tipped with silver, each parked car coated in a thin sheen that cracked when touched. Detective John Carter tightened the collar of his coat as he walked Max along the quiet block, his breath visible in the cool light. He had spent half the night thinking about the shed at the rail yard, replaying the way Max had brought him the leash, the way the dog had refused to shift his gaze from that gray painted door. It would have been easy to write it off as coincidence, a habit formed from training, but something in Max's stillness lingered in John's mind like a note that refused to fade. The morning shift at the station had its routine coffee, too hot to drink fast, the low murmur of Bill Hunter offering updates, the dry humor of Tom Reed filling the gaps. Yet John could not settle. He excused himself earlier than expected and steered the cruiser toward the yard again. Max settled in the back seat with his posture unusually stiff. When they pulled up, the sun had just cleared the cottonwood, spilling pale gold over the gravel. The shed looked exactly as it had the night before, padlock and place vent coated with dust-gray paint dulled in daylight. John cut. The engine stepped out and opened the rear door. Max jumped down without hesitation, nose to the air, drawing in the scent of frost and iron. John set down a stainless steel bowl filled with water and a strip of jerky he kept for rewards. Max glanced once, then turned his head back to the shed body taut with intent. He ignored the food completely. John tried again, pulling a rubber training toy from the trunk, tossing it a few feet away. Max's ears flicked toward the sound of it hitting gravel, but his eyes never left the shed. He sat with the same rigid posture as the night before, tail curled around his paws, every line of him radiating concentration. John felt a small chill unrelated to the air. In years of working with canine units, he had never seen Max disregard food or toys so completely. That was not instinct, not play. It was something deeper, sharper, a deliberate fixation. "All right, buddy," John said quietly, crouching beside him. "Show me." Max stood and walked to the door, nose tracing the seam where wood met block. His breath clouded against the metal hasp. He pressed his muzzle near the vent and inhaled, then stepped back and sat once more, fixing his amber eyes on the door's center, as though marking a point no one else could see. John leaned close to the vent himself. At first, he heard only the hum of wind threading through narrow slats. Then, faint, almost too faint to register, came a different sound. It reminded him of fabric brushing concrete, or perhaps the soft scrape of a shoe sole. He held his breath, straining. There it was again, brief, hesitant, then gone. He straightened, pulse tightening. The station's records claimed the shed was unused, the utilities cut years ago. The only traffic here should have been raccoons or wind. Yet that noise had carried a rhythm, the kind that belonged to human movement. Max looked at him as if to confirm it. John studied the padlock. It was inexpensive, bought at any hardware store, not rusted, the shackle polished from recent handling. The paint around the latch was cleaner than the rest, as though touched more often. He traced the outline with a gloved finger. His mind catalogued details automatically, paint mismatched by half a shade gravel near the threshold darker, as if damp footprints, not obvious but faint disturbances, breaking the frost line. He thought of last night, the leash in Max's mouth, the dirt on the dog's legs. Max had gone back on his own, returned convinced. John took a measured step back and scanned the yard. It lay quiet. No workers, no maintenance trucks, only the still forms of the boxcars and the whisper of cottonwoods. A freight horn carried across the valley, distant but clear. John keyed the radio on his shoulder. Unit 12 at the rail spur checking structure condition, he reported, keeping it bland. Bill Hunter's voice came back warm and steady. "Copy that, Carter. You want backup." John glanced at Max, still locked on the door. He hesitated. "Not yet, just documenting. Will advise if I need another unit." He clipped the radio back. His instinct said not to rush, not to turn this into a circus until he knew more. Yet inside something moved, and he had heard it. He circled the shed slowly, eyes marking details. On the east side, the foundation met gravel in a rough seam concrete poured in 2 stages. One section bulged slightly outward as if patched. He knelt, brushing away frost. The concrete bore faint scratches, shallow lines, not from weather, but from contact with something dragged. They converged near the corner where the vent sat. He pressed his ear near the block. Silence. Then faint again, a noise like a cough smothered by distance. His throat tightened. He moved back to Max, who had not shifted, not blinked. "You're certain?" John whispered. Max's only answer was stillness. The dog's ears twitched once, angled forward, then froze. John knew that posture from narcotic searches when the scent was strongest. It meant confirmation. He checked the time. 9:15. School buses should be making rounds across town, parents at job streets quiet. The rail yard lay isolated enough that few would hear if anything inside shifted. His training urged patience warrants procedure. His gut told him time was already bleeding. He tapped another message into his phone for Bill Shed shows signs of use. Dog fixated. Possible movement inside. Requesting expedited key access. He hit send, slid the phone back into his pocket, and crouched to place a hand on Max's shoulder. The fur bristled under his palm. Max did not flinch, only leaned fractionally forward, weight poised. John whispered, "We wait, but we don't leave." The minutes stretched. A crow settled on a boxcar roof, let out a single caw, then lifted again. John traced the outline of the padlock with his gaze every second, measuring whether the noise inside would repeat. It did. This time clearer, closer, like fabric against wood. His chest felt the small thud of adrenaline. He was no longer doubting. Someone was in there. Max shifted his paw once, almost imperceptible, the smallest gesture of readiness. John nodded slowly. The air smelled sharper now, the metallic tang stronger, riding the draft from the vent. He breathed it in and exhaled, the weight of decision settling. They had crossed from curiosity to certainty. Whatever lay behind that gray door was not random. Max had led him here with purpose, and the sound inside had answered. John rose the crowbar heavy in his hand, though he had not yet used it. He stood beside his partner, eyes on the door, waiting for the call from Bill, waiting for the key, knowing already that suspicion had taken root. They were no longer asking if something was inside. They were waiting to prove it. John Carter remained by the shed long after the first inspection had supposedly proven nothing. The warrant he had requested was still being processed, and Sergeant Bill Hunter had already called him to ease off, repeating with a steady tone that the shed was a ghost cleared months ago by a team who had logged it officially. "Don't waste time, Carter," Bill had said, his voice carrying both authority and familiarity. That place was checked inside out in July, empty as a church on Monday morning. John had answered respectfully, "Copy that, Sarge." But when the line went silent, he stayed where he was, unwilling to leave. He trusted paperwork less than he trusted the shepherd sitting alert beside him. Max had not shifted for nearly 10 minutes, his gaze pinned to the cinder block vent that broke the shed's east wall. His ears flicked once, and then he rose to his feet, nose pressing close to the slats. He inhaled with sharp precision, and then pawed at the great claws, dragging metal against concrete with a sound that carried more message than noise. John crouched quickly, placing his face near the vent. At first he felt nothing but the rough chill of metal against skin. Then the draft reached him. The air was heavy cold and carried with it a sour staleness, something like damp rope and old fabric packed away wet. The odor cut into his stomach sharp enough to make him recoil slightly, pressing his lips together as though the act might block the memory of the scent. He leaned again, slower this time, forcing himself to inhale carefully. The smell grew clearer, unmistakable, not just mildew, but something layered beneath the presence of breath and rot combined. He pulled back and exhaled through his mouth, eyes narrowing. Max's body stiffened further. The shepherd's tail hung low but not tucked, his stance braced as though he had confirmed what his handler was still piecing together. John spoke quietly. "That isn't just stale air." He pressed his palm against the wall beneath the vent and felt faint dampness clinging to the concrete, fresh enough that it hadn't frozen despite the morning chill. He traced the line downward, finding a hairline crack that split into the gravel. He tapped the surface once with his knuckle and registered a hollow vibration too subtle for a casual ear, but sharp enough for a man who had spent years listening for false walls. He stood, swept his gaze around the shed again, cataloging every detail. Padlock, new paint, fresh vent, expelling not stagnant but active air dust streaked near the grate as if brushed from within. Bill's confidence echoed in his head, but confidence did not smell like this, nor did it carry sound. Just as he began to pull away, Max tensed and growled low, the sound vibrating deep in his chest. John froze, ears straining. It came faint but certain, a muffled scrape like fabric shifting against wood. He knew the difference between an animal scurrying and a person trying not to be heard. His throat tightened. He knelt beside Max and whispered, "I heard it too." The dog pressed his nose against the vent again, drawing in a sharp breath, then turned his head toward John with a look that required no translation. There was life inside. John checked the gravel once more, spotting faint disturbances along the base of the wall. Not footprints exactly, but irregularities where frost had been broken, suggesting recent passage. He crouched, touched the ground, and felt the thin crust give way to moist earth underneath. He straightened slowly, considering his next step. Officially, he had nothing but suspicion. Unofficially, he had more than enough a dog that had never lied to him. A vent exhaling air, not from vacancy, but from occupancy, and a noise that carried intention. He drew his phone, typed a message to Bill that was firmer this time. Odor from vent, not consistent with abandonment. Airflow active, dog fixated. Possible concealed space. He sent it, then pocketed the phone and let silence fill the space between his own heartbeat and the muted world around him. The rail yard remained quiet, but the shed had changed. It was no longer a simple box with walls. It was a container holding breath sound and secrets. Max sat again, gaze fixed unflinching on the vent. His growl faded, but his muscles still taut. John stood beside him, steadying his own breathing, knowing that they had crossed a boundary. The superior's dismissal was now just paper. The real truth pressed cold and damp through the thin slats of a vent, waiting for someone willing to listen. John Carter unlocked the shed at midday under a weak November sun, the utility key cold in his hand and the sound of the padlock snapping open sharp enough to echo through the quiet rail yard. He pushed the door inward with a steady arm dust spilling into the light, the smell of old wood and mildew drifting outward in a heavy wave. Max entered first, nose sweeping side to side, body tense but controlled his movements, deliberate and patient. John followed, flashlight raised, though daylight filtered through cracks in the vent. At a glance, the interior looked like every abandoned building John had ever set foot in. Cobwebs hung thick across rafters, peeling paint flaked from the cinder block walls, and a collection of broken chairs leaned at awkward angles against one corner. An old workbench sagged under the weight of rusted tools, their handles splintered, their edges dulled by time. The floor wore a layer of dust undisturbed enough to suggest years without visitors. John crouched near the chairs, ran a gloved finger across the surface, and found a thick coat of gray powder clinging stubbornly. He stood again, sweeping his beam across the ceiling, noting the single light fixture hanging without power. The cracks where rain had crept through the roof. To the eye, nothing stirred. Nothing suggested recent life. He felt the first tug of doubt, the echo of Bill Hunter's certainty that the shed was a ghost already examined and filed away. But Max would not accept it. The shepherd moved with precision, sniffing each corner, ignoring cobwebs and dust as though they were transparent, circling wider until he reached the center of the room. He stopped abruptly on a section of floor where the boards changed grain, a patch that looked newer, less worn than the rest. Max lowered his head, pressed his nose against the surface, then stiffened, a deep growl rolling from his chest. John turned immediately, eyes narrowing. "Show me," he said, stepping closer. Max pawed at the boards, claws clicking in a rhythm too measured to be random. John knelt, tapped the wood with his knuckles, and froze at the sound. It was not the solid thud of boards laid over concrete. It was hollow, a faint vibration traveling upward into his hand. He pressed harder, leaned his weight, and felt the slightest give as though beneath the surface something less stable waited. He sat back on his heels, studying the patch more carefully. Dust around the seams looked disturbed, not brushed evenly like the rest of the floor, but gathered in faint ridges as though the boards had been lifted and replaced. The nails were newer, their heads less corroded, gleaming faintly even under dust. He swept his flashlight across the perimeter, confirming his suspicion. Someone had repaired or concealed something here. Max growled again, refusing to move his body, poised directly over the patch like a guard dog at a threshold. John laid a hand on his partner's back, feeling the bristling fur and taut muscle beneath. "Good work," he whispered. He pressed his ear to the boards, holding his breath, listening. At first, only silence greeted him, the heavy stillness of enclosed air. Then, faint as a sigh, came a vibration too irregular to be machinery. It reminded him of a shift, perhaps the movement of weight against wood. He lifted his head sharply, eyes scanning the room again. The shed still looked like ruin, still dressed in dust and cobwebs, but the floor had betrayed its disguise. He rose slowly, stepping back, weighing the options. He could leave now, report the anomaly, and wait for formal reinforcement. But Max's growl, steady and insistent, told him time was not a luxury. He pulled out his phone, snapped photos of the patch, the newer nails, the dust disturbed along the seams. He typed a quick message to Bill Possible, concealed space beneath shed floor. Dog alerted. Strong odor from vent confirmed. Requesting immediate backup. He hit send, then pocketed the phone, heart steady despite the urgency pressing into his chest. Max pawed again, claws raking sharply, and then sat back down, gaze locked on the floor. John crouched once more, laid his hand flat against the boards, and felt that faint vibration return, irregular and subtle, like something alive resisting silence. He drew a slow breath, exhaled, and knew with certainty that the next step lay beneath them. John Carter knelt over the patch of newer boards, the photos still fresh on his phone, the scent of mildew and damp air clinging to his senses, and Max pressed close beside him, ears pricked, body braced in an intensity that carried more message than words ever could. John slipped the crowbar from his pack and slid its tip under the seam of the boards, giving a careful push. The nails resisted at first, groaning as though reluctant to yield, but under steady pressure, one after another, lifted free with sharp cracks. Dust rose in thin curls, disturbed after being undisturbed far too long, and the first plank shifted upward enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beneath. John paused, flashlight in hand, and angled the beam down. What he saw was not solid foundation, not concrete base as he had expected, but an open cavity where earth had been cut and reinforced with rough beams. A narrow crawl space stretched beneath the shed, so small that an adult could not have discovered it without prying the floor apart. His pulse quickened at the sight. He widened the opening, pulling 2 more boards free until the gap was large enough to lower his head through. The light swept across dirt walls, packed tight wooden supports nailed crudely into place, and a tunnel barely high enough for a child to move upright. The smell intensified, sour and stagnant, the same odor he had caught at the vent. He drew back slowly, eyes narrowing at the crude craftsmanship. This was not an accident of erosion or time. It was deliberate, hidden with care, designed for secrecy. Max stood at the edge of the opening, peered down, then looked at John Tail, stiff posture taut. John whispered, "What do you think, partner?" The dog sniffed into the hole, then stepped back, and with a firm, deliberate motion pressed his shoulder against John's side, pushing him gently but insistently toward the opening. John steadied himself with one hand against the floor, surprised at the force of the message. Max did not move forward himself, did not leap into the space as he often did when scent led him into culverts or alleys. Instead, he stayed rooted, pressing again, with his body urging his handler to be the one to descend. John recognized the difference. This was not hesitation, but decision. The dog had found the path, but was telling him plainly, "This part belongs to you." He angled his flashlight once more, letting the beam stretch farther into the crawl. The tunnel extended perhaps 15 feet before dipping out of sight. The dirt walls bore scrapes not random but patterned marks from something dragged repeatedly along the surface. He felt the hair rise on his arms. He clipped the flashlight to his jacket, tested the edges of the opening, then lowered himself onto his stomach, sliding feet first into the narrow dark. The earth pressed close on either side, the beams low enough that he had to keep his shoulders hunched. Gravel and dirt ground against his palms as he pulled himself forward, the air growing heavier with each movement. Behind him, Max stayed at the edge, head lowered, eyes tracking him, a silent guardian unwilling to leave, but unwilling to retreat. John crawled several feet until his light caught a wooden brace, a head nailed crosswise, forming a kind of threshold. Beneath it, the tunnel dropped slightly enough that the floor carried a different texture, packed smoother as though by repeated passage. He rested a moment, breath-controlled ears straining. A faint sound reached him, almost imperceptible, like the soft displacement of weight farther down. He froze, let the silence stretch, and heard it again, a subtle vibration in the earth, irregular, alive. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and pressed onward, each motion deliberate. His body committed fully to the hidden path that Max had uncovered and insisted he follow. The crawl space widened slightly enough that he could shift to one knee, and there he paused again, beam sweeping across the dirt walls. Faint stains streaked one side, darker than soil, not fresh, but not natural either. He swallowed hard, steadied his breathing, and pushed farther. The tunnel curved, dipping once more into shadow. He glanced back, saw Max's amber eyes above steady and unblinking the dog, waiting, guarding, holding the line above ground while he carried the investigation forward. The message was clear. Whatever lay ahead, they were both in it, but each had a role. John crawled deeper, feeling the vibration beneath the packed earth grow faint but persistent. A pulse that belonged to something hidden, something that could not remain beneath the boards forever. The crawl space bent into a shallow chamber where the dirt walls had been reinforced with planks scavenged from crates, the boards nailed in crooked lines, but steady enough to hold back collapse. John Carter eased himself into the small space, shoulders hunched, flashlight beam cutting arcs across the uneven floor. What he saw pulled the air tight in his lungs. Scattered in the dust lay a pair of small sneakers, no larger than what a child in second grade might wear, the canvas frayed, the laces broken at the ends. Beside them sat a heap of crumpled wrappers from energy bars, their edges curled with grease and smudged by hands too small to belong to laborers. In the far corner, draped over a mound of dirt, lay a blanket patterned faintly with cartoon figures dulled by grime, yet unmistakably recent. He reached out, pressed the fabric between his fingers, and felt warmth still clinging to it, as though someone had left it behind only hours earlier. His pulse hammered in his ears. He had been trained to read rooms, to separate what belonged from what did not, and here nothing belonged to the image of an abandoned rail shed. This chamber bore the imprint of presence of children kept where no child should ever be. He angled his beam lower, noting shallow grooves etched into the floor where objects had been dragged, perhaps makeshift seating or supplies. He steadied his breath and listened. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the faint drip of condensation along one of the beams. He turned his head back toward the opening where Max crouched, body half in shadow, amber eyes locked on him. "You were right," John whispered. He shifted aside to make space. Max slid down into the chamber, paws pressing against dirt with careful weight, nose working furiously. The shepherd sniffed the sneakers, the wrappers, the blanket, then froze, head snapping toward the far wall. His body stiffened, tail, low ears pricked sharp. A deep growl rumbled from his chest. John swung the beam in that direction. The wall looked like the other's planks nailed over dirt, but the grain was different, cleaner, the boards less warped. Max stepped forward, pressing his nose to a seam, then began to paw with methodical force, claws raking wood in steady rhythm. Each strike echoed differently than it should have. Instead of solid earth, the sound carried a hollow resonance. John knelt beside him, pressing his ear against the boards, and heard it clearly, the faint reverberation of empty space beyond. He tapped with his knuckle and confirmed the hollow echo. His throat tightened. Someone had built a false wall. Max continued to claw, urgency in every movement, his body vibrating with focus. John pulled him gently back and examined the surface. Dust along the seams was uneven, brushed recently. One board bore a faint scrape across its edge as though removed and replaced multiple times. He whispered, "This isn't support. It's concealment." He ran his fingers along the seams, feeling for a latch or catch, but found nothing obvious. Whoever built it had meant for it to remain invisible. He leaned his shoulder against the wall, pressing, but the planks held firm. Max barked once, sharp and insistent, then pawed again, gaze cutting to John with an expression that seemed to say there was no time to waste. John steadied himself, shifted his flashlight under his arm, and drew a pry tool from his belt. He wedged it against the seam and pulled hard. The wood resisted groaning, then splintered enough for a crack of darkness to appear. Cold air rushed through, carrying with it the same sour smell he had caught at the vent above ground. He paused, heart pounding, then forced the gap wider. Max pressed forward, nose working at the fresh draft ears, locked in full alert. The shepherd pawed again, guiding his handler to finish what he had begun. John wedged the tool deeper, muscles straining until the plank tore free and clattered onto the chamber floor. Beyond it stretched a black void, the beam of his flashlight swallowed by shadow. He crouched, eyes narrowing as Max pressed his muzzle into the gap, inhaling deeply, then stepping back with a low whine that was neither fear nor retreat, but summons. The false wall had opened a path to something larger, something hidden deliberately, something waiting to be revealed. John Carter steadied his breath as the first plank crashed onto the dirt. The hollow space beyond, yawning dark and unwelcoming, the smell pouring out with the force of a truth that could no longer remain hidden. He angled his flashlight through the gap, its beam cutting into the void, illuminating rough stone walls braced with splintered lumber, a ceiling so low he would need to crawl again. He widened the opening with a second pull, the pry bar biting into old wood until another board gave way, then a third, the space now large enough for him to squeeze through. Max pressed close, his nose darting forward, his body vibrating with alertness. John whispered, "Stay with me," then lowered himself through the breach. The chamber beyond was small, barely the size of a storage closet. Its walls damp and stained, its floor packed dirt, scattered with scraps of cloth. For a moment it looked empty, and then his light caught movement. In the far corner, huddled together, 3 small figures crouched low, their faces pale in the beam. Their eyes widened, pupils sharp under the sudden glare, but no voices rose to greet him. They stared with a silence so deep it seemed rehearsed, as though noise itself could summon danger. John lowered his flashlight, slightly softening its bite, and spoke in a voice as calm as he could manage. "It's all right. My name's John. I'm here to help." Max stepped forward, slow and careful, his tail held low but wagging just once in deliberate reassurance. The children flinched at first, then froze again, their breathing shallow, their hands clutching each other so tightly their knuckles shone white. John crouched low, keeping his posture small, letting Max take the lead. The shepherd stopped a few feet away and lay down flat chin against the dirt, eyes steady on the children. He released a soft whine, gentle as breath. One of the children, a girl with tangled hair falling across her face, blinked rapidly, then inched her hand from the safety of her sibling's grip and reached out tentatively toward the dog. Her fingers trembled in the air until they brushed Max's fur. The shepherd remained perfectly still, eyes closing briefly in calm acknowledgement. The girl gasped, almost too quiet to hear, and then the tension in her shoulders eased. She whispered hoarsely, "He's safe." The others looked from her to John, uncertain, weighing belief against fear. John spoke softly again. "You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you. We're going to take you out of here." He extended a hand, palm open, not pushing, only offering. The smallest child, no more than 5, clutched a scrap of blanket tighter, but shuffled forward until he could touch Max's ear. The shepherd gave a slow wag, low and steady, an anchor of reassurance. The oldest child, perhaps 10, finally lifted his head. His eyes carried more weight than any child should bear. He whispered, his voice rasping, "He comes at night. The man. We hide when we hear him. There are more. Farther in." John's chest tightened at the words. He leaned closer, careful not to alarm them. "More children." The boy nodded quickly, fear flashing across his face. "He takes them deeper. We don't see them much. They cry, but then they get quiet." His gaze flicked toward the rear wall of the chamber where another crude panel of wood stood nailed in place. John felt the knot in his stomach tighten. He glanced at Max, who had already turned his nose toward that wall, sniffing the seams, ears forward, body rigid with focus. The shepherd pawed once the sound sharp in the enclosed space. John steadied his breath and looked back at the children. "We'll get them. You're not alone anymore." He reached into his pocket and pulled free his radio, pressing the transmit button. Static hissed before he spoke, low but clear. "Unit 12 Carter. I have located miners alive beneath the rail shed. Immediate assistance required. 3 in custody, additional suspected. Requesting backup now." He released the button, knowing the signal might be weak underground, but the words had to be tried. Max pawed the wall again, a growl rising low in his throat. John placed a hand on the dog's back. "Easy. We'll get to them." He turned back to the children, lowered his voice. "I need you to be brave a little longer. We're going to bring everyone out one step at a time." The boy whispered again, eyes wide. "You don't understand. He knows when people come. He's coming back." John met his gaze steady. "Then he'll find we're already here." He angled his flashlight back to the false wall, the beam catching seams where boards overlapped unevenly. Max's growl deepened, steady and relentless, urging him forward. John exhaled, decision already forming. The first barrier had revealed life. The next might reveal even more. John Carter kept his body low, guiding the 3 children gently toward the opening he had made in the false wall, the beam of his flashlight cutting a path through the dust. He had already sent one transmission to request backup, though he could not be certain the signal had carried through the earth, and he knew each minute mattered. Max remained steady beside the children, his posture calm, tail wagging in careful rhythm, offering comfort with every slow movement. John whispered reassurances, telling them to keep their eyes on the light, to follow his voice, to remember that outside air waited just a few yards away. The smallest boy clutched the dog's fur, burying his face in it, as if the shepherd alone could anchor him to safety. John had just reached the edge of the chamber when it happened. From somewhere deeper in the structure, muffled but undeniable, came the sudden slam of a heavy door. The sound echoed through the dirt tunnel with a finality that made every child flinch, and John froze in place, muscles tightening as the echo died into silence. His flashlight beam quivered against the wall dust motes swirling in its path. That was no accident, no collapsing timber. It was the distinct sound of a door being closed with force. Someone else was here. The boy who had spoken earlier began to tremble, whispering, "He's here!" his voice tight with terror. John steadied him with a hand on his shoulder. "Stay calm. Keep close." He turned his head toward Max. The dog had already transformed. A moment earlier he had been gentle, coaxing children with stillness and quiet whines. Now his body coiled like a drawn bow. His ears shot forward, his eyes sharpened, and a deep growl rolled from his chest, low and resonant, the kind that signals not fear but readiness. His nose lifted, sampling the air, then dropped low to the dirt, drawing in scent with focused precision. He turned sharply toward the tunnel that led deeper beyond the false wall, the growl tightening into silence as his body aligned into the familiar stance of pursuit. John felt his own heartbeat thud hard against his ribs. He had chased suspects with K9 units before, seen the switch flip from play to purpose, but never had he been so close to the transformation. Max was no longer comforting children. He was hunting. John whispered to the boy, "Stay with the light. Hold on to each other. Do not move until I come back." The boy's eyes were wide, but he nodded quickly, pressing the younger ones close. John rose into a crouch, flashlight gripped tighter, and placed his free hand on Max's back. "Show me," he murmured. The shepherd surged forward a step, paused, looked back at his handler as if to confirm the order, then pressed onward, nose low, body, a silent arrow through the dirt chamber. John followed each step, careful but urgent ears straining for any new sound. The slam of that unseen door lingered in his mind, proof of presence, proof that whoever had built this maze had not abandoned it. They were here watching, perhaps moving toward escape, perhaps circling back. The tunnel bent sharply, the dirt walls pressing closer, beams groaning faintly overhead. Max stopped suddenly, head lifted, nostrils flaring. He swung his gaze to the left, where a side passage narrowed, half-blocked by planks leaning in haphazard piles. He pressed his muzzle against the gap, sniffed, then growled, deep claws scraping dirt as he pawed once. John lifted his flashlight and aimed it through the narrow space. The beam revealed only darkness, yet the air carried something new, the faint musk of sweat and stale clothing layered atop the mold and earth. He knew that smell. It was the trace of human presence recent enough to resist masking. Max stepped back, body taut, gaze locked on the passage. John whispered, "That's where he went." Even as he spoke, another faint sound carried to them, footsteps hurried but distant, striking wood rather than dirt. Then silence again, deliberate silence, as though the figure had stopped upon realizing noise would betray them. Max's tail stiffened his stance, lowering, ready to spring if allowed. John steadied his breathing, forcing calm into his limbs. He turned once toward the chamber where the children waited, saw their small faces faint in the dim light, then faced forward again. The mission had split into two fronts: protect the lives already found and track the predator who still stalked these tunnels. He pressed his hand gently against Max's shoulder. "Not yet," he whispered. "We move smart." Max's growl subsided into a tense stillness, his body trembling with contained drive. John scanned the passage again, noting the fresh scrape marks along the dirt floor, where boots had pressed recently, soil still crumbling at the edges. The trail was fresh, undeniable. He exhaled slowly, knowing that backup might still be minutes away, that every decision now carried weight. The children had given him warning of a man who came at night, a man they feared so deeply that silence had become their only defense. Now that man was here, closer than ever, and the dog had locked on to his scent. The shed was no longer just a hiding place. It had become a hunting ground, and the hunt had begun. John Carter tightened his grip on the flashlight as the sound of footsteps returned this time, sharper, closer, the rhythm of a man trying to move quickly without drawing attention. Max surged forward, growl low in his chest, but John held him back for one beat, listening. The noise came from the side passage, the one half blocked by leaning boards. John shifted forward, angled his light through the gap, and caught a flicker of movement. A figure slipping down the narrow corridor, shoulders hunched, head ducked, arms pumping in urgency. Without thinking, John forced the boards aside, wood splintering as he pressed through, and Max followed with a bark that ricocheted through the cramped tunnel. They advanced fast dirt crunching beneath their boots and paws until John closed the gap. "Police, stop where you are." His voice thundered against the close walls. The figure stumbled, turned, and raised both hands, eyes wide in the sudden light. He was thin, late 20s, clothes dirty but not ragged, a man hardened by nights underground but not confident in the moment. John pushed forward, weapon drawn low but ready. On the ground now. The man dropped palms flat against the dirt, breath ragged. Mac's circled teeth bared in a controlled snarl, eyes locked on the man's every twitch. John cuffed him quickly, checked his waistband, his pockets, no weapon, no tools, only a ring of cheap keys and a packet of jerky. He pressed him against the wall. Voice steady. "Who are you? What are you doing down here?" The man shook his head fast, fear breaking through his features. "I don't know anything, I don't." John cut him off sharply. "You don't get to play dumb. Children are in here. You're with them. Talk." The man swallowed hard, eyes flicking nervously toward the deeper passage. "I'm just supposed to watch. Just keep them quiet. That's all. I swear." John studied him, heart sinking with the realization. This was not the architect, not the predator who came in the night. This was a guard, a decoy someone left behind to slow pursuit. Max seemed to know it instantly. The dog stopped circling, lifted his nose, sniffed sharply at the air, and swung his head away from the captured man. His body stiffened again, ears pointing toward another tunnel that branched from the chamber. He growled low and certain, then pulled against the leash with sudden force. John looked into the shepherd's eyes and understood. This one wasn't the target. The real quarry was moving even now, slipping deeper into the maze. John pulled the man to his feet, shoved him against a support beam, and tied his wrists to it with a strip of cord from his pack. "Stay put," he ordered coldly. The man sagged against the beam, muttering under his breath, but John had already turned away. Max yanked at the lead again, nose pressed low, dragging his handler toward the other passage. John steadied himself, flashlight beam sweeping the ground. Fresh prints marred the dirt, heavier, deeper, a stride longer and more deliberate than the first man's. They were recent, the edges still crumbling. The real predator had chosen another path. John let out a slow breath, adrenaline pressing against his ribs. He whispered, "All right, partner. Lead the way." Max surged forward, guiding him through the tight passage, every muscle a line of pursuit. John followed, ears straining for any sound of movement ahead, aware that each second carried the chance of escape for the man they sought. Behind them, the captured guard slumped in defeat, but the chase had shifted focus. The real confrontation lay just ahead, where shadows still hid the man who had orchestrated it all. The tunnel sloped upward now, the packed earth giving way to stone blocks mortared together in a crude stairwell, and John Carter pushed forward with Max tugging insistently at the lead. The scent trail had grown stronger, sharper, mixed with sweat and fear, the smell of a man on the run who knew the walls around him were closing. John's beam caught scraps of clothing snagged on rough edges, confirming how close they were. Then ahead, the faint scrape of boots echoed a hurried rhythm, desperate but unsteady. Max surged forward, muscles taut, growl rising from deep within his chest. They rounded a sharp corner into a chamber where dim light seeped through cracks in the ceiling. A figure moved fast along the far wall, fumbling with a wooden hatch built into the stone. His shoulders strained as he tried to pry it upward. His breath ragged curses muttered under his breath. He turned his head just enough for John to catch his face, older than the guard, hardened eyes narrow and calculating, the lines of control etched deep. This was no decoy. This was the man. John shouted, "Police." "Step away from the hatch." The man froze, then lunged harder, determined to escape. John rushed forward, but Max was faster. The shepherd launched with precision, a blur of muscle and intent colliding with the man's arm and dragging him sideways. The hatch slammed shut again. As the man fell hard against the wall, Max clamped onto his forearm in a perfect hold, not tearing, not mauling, but locking him down with unyielding force. The man shouted in pain, thrashing, but Max adjusted his grip, pressing him flat against the dirt floor, teeth steady but controlled. John closed the gap weapon ready, but held low eyes fixed on the struggle. "Release him only when I say," he ordered, and Max held his place, growl vibrating like thunder through the chamber. John cuffed the man's wrists behind his back, pressing the metal tight until the ratchet clicked into place. He pulled Max gently back. "Out," he commanded, and the shepherd released instantly, stepping aside, but keeping his eyes trained on the man with unwavering focus. The suspect sagged against the floor chest, heaving defeat, replacing fury in his expression. John keyed his radio voice firm. "Primary suspect in custody. Repeat, primary suspect secured. Need immediate extraction at my location." Static buzzed, then faint acknowledgement carried through the first relief of contact all night. John exhaled slowly, eyes sweeping the chamber. Supplies littered the space, water jugs, blankets, empty food cans stacked in corners, signs of long-term concealment. But Max was not finished. The shepherd sniffed along the walls, weaving carefully, nose pressed to stone seams, ignoring the man still bound on the floor. He reached the far corner, paused, then scratched deliberately at a section where mortar lines looked uneven. John crossed quickly, knelt, and pressed his ear against the wall. At first, only silence greeted him. Then came the faintest sound, soft breathing, muffled movement like a collective tremor of fear hidden behind stone. John's chest tightened. He stood scanning the seams and spotted a narrow outline where bricks had been mortared differently. Max pawed again, growl low but certain. John turned to the suspect, voice sharp. "How many more?" The man only sneered, lips pressed thin. John shook his head, already knowing silence would be his answer. He gripped the pry bar again, wedged it into the seam, and pulled with all his strength. The first brick shifted, dust spilling down. Max barked once, sharp encouragement, tail stiff as he pressed against the base of the wall. John worked brick after brick until the gap widened enough for his flashlight beam to pierce through. What it revealed made his breath catch. In the hidden chamber beyond, huddled in a line against the far wall, were children, smaller, younger than the others. He had found some barely able to stand, others clutching each other tightly. Their eyes reflected the beam wide with terror, but alive. John forced the opening wider, speaking as gently as he could. "You're safe now. We're here to take you out." Max stepped forward, lowered his body, and crawled halfway through the gap, his head reaching the children. He released a soft whine, his eyes steady and calm. One by one, the children shifted forward, hesitant at first, until a little girl with a stuffed bear pressed against her chest reached out to touch his fur. When she did, the tension in the group broke, and the others began moving too, crawling into the light where John guided them out carefully, one at a time. He counted as he lifted them, 5, 6, 7, all from the hidden chamber, all pulled from the dark into the safety of his arms. By the time the last child was out, officers had arrived through the stairwell above, their flashlights bouncing against the walls, their voices carrying orders and relief in equal measure. The suspect was dragged upright, still cuffed, his curses ignored as he was marched away. John stood in the center of the chamber. Children clustered around him. Max moving from one to the next, sniffing gently, his tail wagging low in careful reassurance. John rubbed the dog's neck, voice tight with emotion. "You found them all, partner, every last one," He looked at the children, their small faces slowly warming with the first flickers of trust, then at the broken wall that had concealed them. The labyrinth had given up its final secret, and it was a dog's instinct that had made sure none were left behind. That's how one dog's loyalty led to the rescue of 23 children who might never have been found. What part of this story struck you the most, the moment Max refused to leave the house or the discovery of the hidden rooms? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you want more stories of courage and loyalty, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel.